Everyone up. You're leaving right now.
For what reason?
We're dining peacefully.
You match a description. Show ID.
That's not lawful call.
You're refusing a direct order.
Judge David Whitaker, U.S. District Court. You're targeting my family without justification.
They've done nothing wrong.
The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a pale glow over the late-night diner. The smell of fresh coffee, syrup, and butter hung in the air, familiar and comforting. It was the kind of place people went when they wanted something simple, something easy, food that didn't ask questions. Judge David Whitaker sat in a booth near the back, his jacket folded neatly beside him. Across from him was his wife, Elaine, exhausted but smiling faintly. Between them sat their two children, 16-year-old Marcus scrolling quietly on his phone, and 9-year-old Ava carefully stacking sugar packets into a crooked tower. It had been a long day. Whitaker had spent hours on the bench, listening to arguments, weighing evidence, issuing rulings that carried consequences for strangers he would never meet again. Elaine had just finished a late shift at the clinic. The kids had homework, sports practice, and the usual chaos of a weekday evening. No one wanted to cook. No one wanted to talk much. They just wanted to eat. The Waffle House was nearly empty. A truck driver sat near the counter, nursing a mug of coffee. Two night shift workers shared a booth by the window. Behind the counter, the manager, Lisa, checked receipts and occasionally glanced up to make sure everything was running smoothly. Nothing about the Whitaker family stood out. They weren't loud. They weren't arguing. They weren't bothering anyone. They were just a black family eating dinner. The server had already taken their order. Plates of waffles and hash browns steamed gently as they were set down. Ava smiled when hers arrived. Marcus finally put his phone away. Elaine reached for her coffee. That's when the door opened. The bell above it chimed once, sharp and sudden. A uniformed police officer stepped inside. His boots echoed just a little too loudly against the tile floor. His posture was rigid, deliberate, as if the entire room existed for him to assess. He paused near the entrance, scanning faces, tables, movements. His eyes stopped on the Whitaker family, and they stayed there. Judge Whitaker felt it before he saw it. The weight of attention that doesn't belong, the kind that presses down without permission. He looked up slowly. The officer was already walking toward their booth. No greeting, no smile, no explanation, just authority, moving closer. The officer stopped beside the table, close enough that Whitaker could smell stale coffee on his breath. His voice cut through the diner, loud and commanding. Everyone up. You're leaving right now. The room went quiet. Ava froze, her hands still wrapped around her fork. Marcus looked up, confused. Elaine's shoulders stiffened. Judge Whitaker didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He simply looked up and asked calmly, "For what reason?" "We're dining peacefully." The officer stepped closer, closing the distance deliberately, a silent threat wrapped in uniform. "You match a description. Show ID." Whitaker felt the shift then, the familiar turn from inconvenience to confrontation. His voice remained steady. "That's not lawful cause." The officer's jaw tightened. "You're refusing a direct order." Whitaker straightened slightly, his tone firm now, precise, practiced. "I'm Judge David Whitaker, U.S. District Court. You're targeting my family without justification." A pause. Not silence, tension. Across the diner, heads had turned. Forks hovered midair. Lisa, the manager, stopped what she was doing behind the counter. The officer exhaled sharply through his nose. This was no longer routine, and everyone in the room could feel it. The officer didn't move away. If anything, he leaned in closer, his shadow falling across the table, stretching over half-eaten waffles and untouched coffee cups. His presence felt intentional now, designed to dominate the space, to remind everyone nearby who held power. "IDs. Now," he said again, slower this time, as if volume alone could turn an unlawful demand into a legal one. Elaine glanced at David. Not in panic. Just a quiet question passed between two people who had learned, long ago, how quickly moments like this could turn dangerous. Marcus's phone was no longer in his hands. Ava's sugar packets toppled as her fingers trembled. David spoke carefully. "Officer, we're not causing a disturbance. We haven't been accused of a crime. There's no legal basis for." The officer cut him off. "You don't get to lecture me on the law." His voice rose just enough to carry. A few booths away, the truck driver turned in his seat. One of the night shift workers put her fork down. Lisa stepped out from behind the counter. her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding near the back of her restaurant. Elaine finally spoke. "What description?" she asked. "Can you explain what you mean?" The officer ignored her entirely. His attention was locked on David now, as if the rest of the family didn't exist. "Last chance," he said. "Show ID, or this gets worse." David exhaled slowly. Years in a courtroom had taught him restraint, but this wasn't a courtroom. This was a diner, and the law felt very far away. "For the record," David said evenly, "we are not required to present identification without reasonable suspicion. You haven't articulated any." That did it. The officer's face hardened, his voice sharp with irritation. "You're refusing a lawful order." "No," David replied, just as calm. "I'm asserting my rights." The officer laughed once, short, humorless. "People like you always say that." The words landed heavy. Marcus looked up sharply. Elaine's jaw clenched. Ava leaned closer to her mother, instinctively seeking shelter. Across the diner, phones began to appear, not openly yet, but subtly. Screens angled just enough to capture what was happening without drawing attention. Lisa walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "Officer," she said carefully, "is there a problem here?" The officer didn't turn to face her. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped. "It does," Lisa replied, firmer now. "They're customers. They haven't broken any rules." The officer finally looked at her, eyes narrowing. "I'm conducting police business." Lisa nodded once. "Then please explain it." "Because from where I'm standing, they're just eating dinner." The officer's hand moved to his belt, not to his weapon, but close enough that the message was unmistakable. The room seemed to shrink around them. David felt Ava's small hand grip his sleeve under the table. "Dad," she whispered, "are we in trouble?" He swallowed. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "We're not." The officer heard it and scoffed. "Tell that to her when this turns into cuffs." That was when David reached into his jacket pocket. Not quickly, not dramatically, deliberately. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up. "I'm recording," he said clearly. The officer exploded. "Put that phone down. Now." "I have the right to record a public official in a public place," David replied. "I don't care about your rights," the officer barked. "You're being difficult." Lisa stepped forward another inch. "Officer," she said, voice tight but controlled, "lower your voice. There are children here." He turned on her instantly. "Then maybe they shouldn't have acted suspicious." The words echoed. Suspicious. For sitting. For eating. For existing. The diner had gone completely silent now. Every eye was on them. Every phone was out. And somewhere between the clink of cutlery and the hum of fluorescent lights, it became clear. This wasn't about a description. This wasn't about safety. This was about power. And the officer was losing control of the room. The officer stood rigid, jaw clenched, eyes darting around the diner as he realized something had shifted. What had started as a quiet act of intimidation was no longer contained to one booth. It was public now. Witnessed. Recorded. Lisa didn't back away. She squared her shoulders and spoke clearly, making sure her voice carried just enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Officer, I'm the manager on duty," she said, "and I'm asking you to explain why you're harassing my customers." The word harassing hit harder than she expected. The officer turned fully toward her, irritation flashing across his face. "You need to step aside," he said. "This is police business." Lisa didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. "This is my restaurant," she replied, "and I'm responsible for what happens inside it." A low murmur rippled through the diner. Someone near the counter whispered, "She's right." Another voice muttered, "They ain't doing nothing." David kept his phone steady, angling it so both the officer and Lisa were clearly visible. He said nothing now. Silence, he knew, could be just as powerful as argument. The officer noticed the phone again. "I told you to stop recording," he snapped. David answered without emotion. "I'm documenting." That single word changed the officer's posture. His chest rose as he took a sharp breath, the kind people take when they're trying not to lose their temper. "Everyone up," he repeated louder now. "You're all leaving." "For what reason?" David asked calmly. No answer. Lisa stepped in immediately. "They're not leaving," she said. "They haven't violated any policy, and they've paid for their food." The officer stared at her, stunned, like he couldn't believe a restaurant manager was standing between him and compliance. "You're interfering," he warned. "I'm protecting my customers," Lisa replied. Behind them, the truck driver stood up from his stool. "Officer," he said, raising his hand slightly. I've been watching this the whole time. They haven't done a thing. A woman near the window followed. Yeah, she added. This is messed up. The officer spun toward the voices. Everyone mind your business. But it was too late. This was everyone's business now. David's phone captured it all. The officer's raised voice, Lisa's steady stance, the uneasy fear in Elaine's eyes as she kept one arm around Ava and the other resting protectively near Marcus. Elaine finally spoke again. We just want to eat, she said quietly. Please. The officer scoffed. You people always play the victim. The room reacted instantly. A sharp inhale from multiple directions. Someone cursed under their breath. Marcus stiffened beside his father, his face burning, not with fear, but with humiliation. David's voice dropped, precise and unshaking. Officer, he said, your statements are being recorded. I advise you to choose your words carefully. That did something. The officer looked around and saw it. Dozens of phones now openly raised. Red recording icons glowing in the dim diner light. Faces that would remember him. Evidence he couldn't undo. Lisa crossed her arms. I'm calling this in, she said. The officer laughed again, but it sounded strained. You gonna call my boss? He mocked. Yes, Lisa replied. I am. She turned and walked back toward the counter, not hurried, not dramatic. Purposeful. The officer followed her halfway, then stopped, suddenly unsure whether chasing her would make things worse. David spoke again, steady as stone. My family will remain seated, he said. We're not resisting. We're not leaving. And we're not breaking the law. The officer stared at him, breathing heavy. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lisa picked up the phone behind the counter. Hi, she said clearly. Yes, I need a supervisor dispatched to my location immediately. An officer is escalating a situation with compliant customers. The officer's face drained of color. The power he'd relied on, the assumption of silence, fear, isolation, was gone. Now there were witnesses. Now there was a record. And now, the night was heading somewhere he could no longer control. The officer heard the words supervisor dispatched and froze, just for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but David caught it on camera. A flicker of hesitation. A crack in the armor. Then the officer straightened his back, as if reminding himself who he was supposed to be. You didn't need to do that, he said to Lisa, his voice tight. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. Lisa kept the phone tucked against her shoulder, her eyes never leaving him. No, she replied. You did. The officer turned back toward the Whitaker family, his face now set with stubborn resolve. All right, he said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Since you want to be difficult, let's do this the hard way. Elaine's breath caught. Officer, she said, trying one last time to defuse. Our children are scared. He waved her off. Should have thought about that before refusing orders. That was the moment the room fully turned. A man near the window stood up. That's enough. Another voice followed. You're out of line. Phone stayed raised. No one sat down. David remained still, his voice controlled but firm. You're escalating without cause, he said. That's on video. The officer stepped closer, too close, his presence invading the booth again. Ava shrank against her mother. Marcus clenched his fists under the table. Put the phone down, the officer growled. No, David replied. The officer's hand hovered near his radio. I can make this very uncomfortable for you. David met his eyes. Then you'll answer for it. The officer scoffed, turning his attention to the crowd now. Everyone filming. This is an active police situation. No, it isn't, Lisa called from behind the counter. And you know it. A murmur of agreement swept through the diner. The officer paced once, then stopped, frustration leaking through his posture. He had expected fear, compliance, maybe a quick ID check followed by quiet embarrassment. Instead, he had resistance. Witnesses. A manager who wouldn't back down. He pointed at David. You think wearing a suit and talking fancy makes you above the law? David didn't raise his voice. No, he said. I think the law applies to everyone, including you. The officer's face flushed. You don't tell me how to do my job. I do when you're violating rights, David answered. The air felt electric now. Thick. Heavy. From outside, faint sirens could be heard, still distant, but unmistakable. The officer heard them too. He turned sharply toward the door, then back to the booth, as if deciding whether to retreat or assert himself further. He chose wrong. Stand up, he ordered Elaine. Now. Lisa moved instantly. No, she said. You are not ordering my customers around. The officer rounded on her. You're interfering with an investigation. I'm documenting misconduct, Lisa replied. And so is everyone else. She gestured to the phones. David spoke again, calm but resolute. You have no legal authority to remove us. Any physical contact will be unlawful. The officer clenched his jaw so hard it looked like it might crack. Outside, the sirens grew louder. This was no longer his call alone, and he knew it. But instead of stepping back, instead of de-escalating, he did what would ultimately cost him everything. He spoke the truth of what he was thinking. People like you don't belong here, he said coldly. You bring trouble everywhere you go. The words fell into the diner like shattered glass. No one moved. No one spoke. Every phone captured it. Every witness heard it. And in that moment, the incident crossed an invisible line. From confrontation to exposure. The sirens grew louder, no longer distant, no longer ignorable. Blue and red light flickered briefly through the front windows of the diner, washing over the counter, the chrome stools, the wide, unblinking eyes of the customers who had not sat down since the confrontation began. The officer heard them and swallowed. The confidence he had leaned on moments earlier faltered, replaced by irritation sharpened with anxiety. He took a step back from the Whitaker family, not out of restraint, but calculation. The front door opened. Another officer walked in. Officer Reynolds. Younger. Alert. His eyes immediately took in the room. The raised phones, the tense silence, the black family seated rigidly in the back booth, the manager standing firmly behind the counter like a line that would not be crossed. Reynolds frowned. What's going on? He asked. Before anyone else could answer, the first officer spoke fast. They're refusing orders, causing a disturbance. Reynolds looked at the family, then at Lisa, then at the phones. Doesn't look like a disturbance, he said carefully. Lisa didn't waste the moment. Officer, she said, they were eating dinner. He approached them without cause, demanded ID, threatened removal, and made discriminatory statements. I called for a supervisor. Reynolds turned to the first officer slowly. Is that accurate? The officer's nostrils flared. She's exaggerating. David lifted his phone slightly. It's all recorded, he said calmly. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. Okay, he said. Let's slow this down. The first officer bristled. I don't need you slowing anything down. But the room no longer belonged to him. Another set of footsteps entered behind Reynolds. A third officer. Then, finally, the supervisor. Lieutenant Harris stepped inside with a presence that immediately shifted the balance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply observed. Phones lowered slightly, not out of fear, but respect for the gravity of what was happening now. Harris looked at the Whitaker family. Are you okay? He asked. Elaine nodded, though her hands still trembled. We're shaken, she said. But we're fine. Harris turned to David. You recording? Yes, sir. Good, Harris said simply. The first officer stiffened. Harris turned to him. Explain, he said. The officer launched into a defensive explanation, vague references to suspicion, to instinct, to maintaining order. He spoke quickly, tripping over his own justifications. Harris listened for less than a minute. Then he raised a hand. That's enough. The diner felt like it exhaled. Harris turned back to David. Your judge, David Whitaker? David nodded. Yes. Harris nodded once more. Sir, on behalf of the department, I apologize. The words landed heavy. The first officer stared at him. What? He snapped. Harris ignored him. You and your family are free to finish your meal, Harris continued. You were never under investigation. You did nothing wrong. Elaine closed her eyes, tears finally spilling over. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Ava leaned fully into her mother. Harris turned sharply toward the first officer. You, he said quietly, step outside. Now. The officer opened his mouth to argue. Harris cut him off with a look. Outside, through the glass, the confrontation continued. Animated gestures, sharp words, a supervisor no longer protecting someone who had crossed too many lines. Inside, Lisa approached the booth. I'm so sorry, she said to the family. Your meal is on us. Anything else you want, dessert, drinks, whatever you need. David nodded gratefully. Thank you, he said, for standing up. Lisa shook her head. It was the right thing. Around them, customers approached quietly, words of support, nods of solidarity, one man offering to send his video if needed. Outside, the first officer's shoulders slumped. The power he had abused was gone, and the consequences were just beginning. The family didn't leave right away. They sat there for several minutes after the officer was escorted outside, the diner slowly returning to motion around them. Forks moved again. Coffee was poured, but the air still felt different, like something permanent had been carved into the walls. David finally lowered his phone. His hand ached. Elaine reached for him across the table, her fingers wrapping tightly around his. Marcus stared at the tabletop, replaying everything in his head. Ava swung her legs beneath the booth, quiet now, her earlier playfulness replaced by exhaustion. Lisa returned with fresh plates. "On the house," she said gently. "Take your time." David nodded. "Thank you for not looking away," he said. Lisa met his eyes. "I wasn't raised to." They finished their meal in silence, the kind that follows adrenaline. When they finally stood to leave, several customers clapped softly, not celebratory, but respectful, acknowledging what had happened, acknowledging survival. Outside, the night felt colder. David sat in the car for a long moment before turning the key. Then, without ceremony, he uploaded the video. No dramatic caption, just the truth. "This happened tonight while my family was eating dinner." He didn't expect much. He expected evidence. By morning, the video had tens of thousands of views. By noon, it had hundreds of thousands. By evening, it was everywhere. News outlets replayed the clip of the officer ordering a black family to leave without cause. Commentators froze the frame where he said, "People like you don't belong here." The manager's calm refusal to back down went viral too. So did David's voice, measured, unshaking, as he identified himself and asserted the law. The department released a statement within 24 hours. An internal review has been initiated. It wasn't enough. Civil rights groups demanded answers. Legal analysts weighed in. Former officers shook their heads on television, calling the behavior indefensible. Then came the announcement. The officer had been placed on administrative leave. His badge and firearm were confiscated. An internal affairs investigation was underway. David and Elaine sat at their kitchen table that night, the glow of the laptop illuminating their faces. "We didn't ask for this," Elaine said quietly. "No," David replied. "But it found us." The calls began the next day. Attorneys, journalists, advocacy groups. One call stood out. A civil rights lawyer who didn't promise revenge, only accountability. Lisa was interviewed too. She told the truth plainly. They were customers. They deserved respect. Corporate praised her publicly. Privately, they promoted her. The officer's past began to surface. Complaints, patterns, silence. The video hadn't just shown one night. It showed a history. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. The lawsuit wasn't about money. That was the first thing David told the attorney. "It's about the line," he said. "And what happens when someone crosses it?" The complaint was filed quietly at first. No press conference. No spectacle. Just facts laid out in careful language. Constitutional violations, unlawful detention, racial discrimination, emotional distress inflicted on minors. Once it became public, the reaction was immediate. Legal experts weighed in across every major network. Former judges, prosecutors, and civil rights scholars all said the same thing in different ways. There was no lawful basis for the stop. The department tried to control the narrative. They emphasized policy, training, procedure, but the video kept playing. The officer's words kept echoing. And then Internal Affairs finished its review. The findings were blunt. The officer had violated department policy. He had escalated without cause. He had engaged in discriminatory conduct. Worse, this wasn't his first complaint. It was his fifth. Previous reports had been minimized, unsubstantiated, lack of evidence, officer discretion. This time, there was evidence, and witnesses, and a nation watching. The termination came on a Friday afternoon, effective immediately. No badge, no pension, no quiet reassignment, just a press release. The officer released a statement through his union, claiming he was being sacrificed for optics. It only made things worse. Meanwhile, the city's attorneys reached out. They wanted to talk settlement. Behind closed doors, the conversations were tense. The city knew the risk. Juries did not respond well to videos like this, especially when children were involved. David and Elaine listened carefully. They asked questions. They set conditions. Any settlement would include funding for bias training, policy changes on stops in private businesses, and a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Months passed. Then the number came. $2.1 million. The city called it a resolution. The public called it accountability. David called it necessary. Part of the funds went into a trust for Marcus and Ava. Another portion was earmarked for civil rights initiatives. The rest ensured the family would never have to fear retaliation for speaking the truth. Lisa attended the press conference. She stood quietly behind them. When a reporter asked why she intervened, she answered simply, "Because silence is a choice." The city promised reforms. Some happened, some didn't. But one thing was certain: that officer would never wear a badge again. And every department in the state took notice. After the cameras left and the headlines faded, life didn't return to normal overnight. It never does. Marcus went back to school carrying something heavier than a backpack. Classmates asked questions, some well-meaning, some careless. Teachers pulled him aside, unsure what to say. He learned quickly how visible injustice can make you feel invisible at the same time. Ava started sleeping with the hallway light on again. Elaine noticed it first. She didn't ask why. She just left it on. David returned to the courtroom within weeks. Same bench, same robe, same oath. But he listened differently now. When defendants spoke about fear, about power, about being unheard, he understood it not just intellectually, but viscerally. Lisa's promotion became official. Regional manager. She used her new position deliberately, mandating de-escalation training for staff, formalizing protocols for law enforcement interactions, reminding employees that protecting customers was not insubordination. Other managers followed, quietly at first, then openly. Across the state, departments circulated the video internally, not as punishment, but as warning. This is what not to do. Recruit classes watched it in silence. Some officers bristled. Others nodded. Community forums formed. Not performative ones, real ones. Parents spoke. Teenagers spoke. Officers listened, some for the first time. David and Elaine declined most interviews after the settlement. They didn't want to become symbols, but they did agree to one. At the end of it, the interviewer asked David a final question. "Would you do anything differently?" He paused, then answered, "I would still record. I would still speak. And I would still stay seated." The diner reopened fully renovated months later. Same smell of coffee. Same humming lights. But something was different. A plaque hung near the counter. "This is a place of respect. Everyone is welcome." It wasn't court-ordered. Lisa put it there herself. People noticed. And sometimes, that's how change actually happens. Years from now, people would forget the officer's name. They always do. But they would remember the video. Not because it was loud. Not because it was violent. But because it showed something rare. Restraint in the face of abuse. Courage without shouting. Power that refused to bow to intimidation. A family sitting at a table, choosing dignity. A manager stepping forward, choosing responsibility. A room full of strangers, choosing not to look away. That night at the diner was never about waffles or coffee. It was about a line, thin, invisible, and constantly tested. The line between authority and abuse. Between order and fear. Between silence and accountability. When the officer crossed it, he expected compliance. Instead, he found resistance. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that holds. David still keeps the video archived. He doesn't watch it often. Neither does Elaine. But they know it's there, proof that the law isn't just words on paper, and that rights only matter when someone is willing to stand on them. Marcus went on to study law. Ava learned that her voice mattered, even when it shook. Lisa still manages restaurants, but her staff know one thing without being told. Customers come first. Always. The $2.1 million settlement made headlines for a week. The lesson lasted longer. Because justice doesn't always arrive with sirens or verdicts. Sometimes it shows up quietly. In a booth near the back of a diner. Under fluorescent lights. With a phone held steady. And a simple refusal to move.